So
Oh, yes, now it says it's recording. Okay, great. So our attendees list is getting higher and higher, and that's great. So we are going to get started with our third of 6 Emerald Ash Borer Awareness Week webinars being hosted by the Don't Move Firewood team, as well as being co-promoted by the Emerald Ash Borer University folks, which was really helpful to make sure that our message got out to everybody. My name is Leigh Greenwood, and I will be giving this presentation along with the other person you can see, Laurel Downs. Laurel, next slide, please. Just a quick review. We had 2 webinars yesterday. One was on breeding, and the other one was on a series of research studies designed to reduce the spread of emerald ash borer conceptually. Today, we will have a Meet the Don't Move Firewood team webinar. That's the one you're on, as well as later today, we will have an on-the-ground management webinar by Bob Bruner, Purdue University, about saving trees that are in highly affected emerald ash borer areas. Tomorrow, we will have 2 additional webinars. One will be about Canada, both the New Vancouver infestation as well as other infestations and responses in Canada. And then our last webinar will be at 3 o'clock Eastern time, and it'll be about the Oregon infestation near Portland, Oregon. Each of these webinars will be about 40 minutes of presentation time and about 15 minutes of Q&A. Like I mentioned earlier, if you have questions that pertain directly to the presentation itself, please try to put them in the Q&A box of Zoom. If you have questions that are sort of like technical or similar, and they really would be easier to deal with in the chat, we will attempt to get with them in the chat. Additionally, we love it when people put their name, location, and professional or volunteer affiliation in the chat. It really helps us understand the audience, as well as if you have a question later, sort of where you're coming from. So if anybody would be willing to type that right into the chat, that would be great. To sign up for the 3 remaining webinars over the course of the next day and a half, there's an easy link. You go to don'tmovefirewood.org/EAB Week 2024. And that particular link will allow you to sign up for each independent webinar. They each have their own link and sign up system. Please don't assume that the link now will help you with the other 3 webinars later. It will not. All right, we've got a bunch of people putting in their names and affiliations and locations into the chat, so that's fantastic. Next slide, please, Laurel. Okay, so today's morning webinar is called Meet Don't Move Firewood. And what we're going to do is talk about actually the activities of the campaign at large. So this is a broad overview of all of the services and activities that Don't Move Firewood conducts throughout a typical year, and what you all can do to get involved. Next slide. So quick review for anybody who's not particularly familiar with Don't Move Firewood from the broadest perspective. It is not an emerald ash borer specific campaign. Firewood is a broad pathway for many types of invasive forest insects and diseases. And forest pests can and do often move on infested or contaminated firewood throughout North America and the world. Regrettably, for the sake of consistency, the regulations that pertain to firewood are not comprehensive between states or regions or countries or provinces in the case of Canada, nor are they consistently written or enforced or crafted to cover firewood versus pest-related responses and so forth. Further, new pest outbreaks come to light every year. So the outreach and education environment of firewood is really complex because the examples and the sort of problem of the day is frequently changing, and that can be very confusing to the public. Next slide. So in order to tackle all of these challenges and complexities, we use some guiding principles in order to make sure that Don't Move Firewood focuses on what it's really meant to do. And its goal and what it is really truly meant to do is to protect the health of trees. We are not here to regulate firewood. We are here to protect trees. And for instance, one of the tactics that you can use to protect trees is to slow the spread of invasive forest pests via firewood pathways. There are many other valid and important tactics to protect trees. We are simply only addressing this one. The target of our tactic, which is who actually needs to hear the message to not move firewood long distances, is firewood users and their stakeholder group educators. Many of you would qualify as a group educator on this webinar. That's why you're here today. But maybe some of you are just firewood users or firewood vendors or firewood collectors. All of those folks are the types of folks that need to hear about this program because they are the ones that are potentially moving firewood or making choices not to move firewood. Last but not least, we try to frame our primary message, don't move firewood, in several positive action-oriented steps. Instead of not moving firewood, you should buy it where you burn it. You should gather it on site whenever that's feasible and safe and allowed by the landowner. Or you should buy certified heat-treated firewood when it's available on the market, which is not consistent across North America. So that's where education comes in to make sure that you don't provide that message if it's not realistic for your area. Next slide, please. We make firewood outreach tools consistent for everybody. And with this slide, I'm going to hand it to Laurel to go through what we offer.
Can you hear me okay? Does it sound okay? Okay. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the content on our website. It's very useful for, as Leigh mentioned, not only the public, but also other folks who work in the forest health realm. So we have our resource library, which has a bajillion different resources such as graphics and other things that you can pull right out and use as you see fit. Or if you want something customized for your location or for your needs, that is something that we would be happy to work with you on to do at no cost to you. If you wanted something printed, those printing costs would be on you. But as far as the design and the customization, that is a service that we provide. We also have a really handy tool for the public. It's designed for the public. Of course, it's useful to everyone. And that's our firewood map. So this is an interactive tool. Folks can go on there and click on any state or province that they want to learn about the situation as it pertains to firewood in that area. So any rules, regulations, resources from the agencies in that state, the pest situation or threats that we're worried about for that state. And then I think I already said, of course, any regulations. So that's really helpful. And it is all in like really simple terms to try to limit the amount of confusion in a very otherwise kind of confusing landscape. So we also have information on the forest pests and pathogens that use firewood as a vector, and even more that aren't even known to move on firewood or could potentially move on firewood. So a lot of great content there. We have our news blog site, which is a tab at the top, and that has information like this webinar series in it. So you can keep up to date with that. We also have a Spanish language microsite. So 10 of our most popular web pages have been translated to Spanish. And then, as I mentioned, we have a lot of resources for other outreach professionals and folks who work in forest health. And I will be talking a little bit more in depth about one of those in particular in a little bit. Okay, so given that it is Emerald Ash Borer Awareness Week, I thought it would be good to talk a little bit about this notorious firewood hitchhiker. So we know that emerald ash borer was discovered in Michigan in the early 2000s. It had very likely already been there for a few years before detection, as it was very much established in that area. Now, unfortunately, it has spread to 36 states in the US alone, and eradication attempts have proven unsuccessful. So that has led to millions upon millions of dead ash trees. It looks like all of the native ash trees to North America are susceptible to this pest. And so it's one of the most, if not the most detrimental forest pest in the country today. Emerald ash borer was regulated both domestically and internationally in the United States for a couple decades. So this means that we were trying to keep emerald ash borer both out of the country, so any more introductions, which we still are, as well as the interstate spread of the pest with that federal regulation. The quarantine also provided the authority to run heat treatment certification programs, which really benefited the firewood industry. So if a firewood business was within the quarantine area and they wanted to export firewood out, they would have to get that firewood heat treated, so heated up in a firewood kiln for a certain period of time at a certain temperature, and the USDA would certify those kilns so that they could successfully and safely then export that treated firewood outside of the quarantine area. We no longer have the domestic part of that quarantine. So that was rescinded in mid-January of 2021. It was effective. And then this really kind of upheaved an already hodgepodge regulatory environment across the United States. So it changed a lot of things in terms of firewood movement. And it left states, tribes, and various land-owning entities with the decision of whether or not they wanted to implement their own means of trying to prevent further spread of this pest. So some states have implemented their own state-based quarantines, both internal and external. And others have created their own state-based firewood certification programs in those areas that lost that ability along with the domestic quarantine. And so this is a lot of information to kind of keep track of, and it's part of our job to get all this information in one place and be able to effectively communicate it to, again, as Leigh mentioned, not only the public, but also other forest health professionals, because as I said, it's a lot. And so it can confuse even folks who are very familiar with this stuff. But for the folks who aren't very familiar with this stuff, I think it's important to just talk about quarantines really quickly, so you know exactly what we're speaking about. There are two basic types of quarantines: external, or sometimes referred to as exterior quarantines, as well as internal or interior quarantines. Exterior quarantines, you're basically trying to keep something out of an area. So if it's for emerald ash borer, maybe you don't have that pest yet in your state, and you put up a regulation to prevent introduction of it. Interior quarantine is you are trying to contain something within an area so you can manage it and prevent the further spread of it outside of the boundary. Most quarantines that are relevant to firewood movement are not firewood specific. They are pest-based quarantines under which firewood is a regulated article, usually among many other regulated articles, which are known to be a vector for the spread of pests. So when you have a quarantine, regulated article such as firewood cannot legally cross those quarantine boundaries without some sort of a compliance agreement, which usually incorporates the heat treatment or inspection, certification, written exemption, something like that. So again, we talked about certifying heat treatment. That would be, if you did it to the right standards, then that would be allowed to pass the boundary. But so something needs to happen there. You can't just willy-nilly be traveling with these regulated articles. So as far as emerald ash borer, again, getting specific to this pest, we do see a bunch of exterior quarantines relevant to this pest in the United States. So anywhere you see a green square there, that's a state that has implemented their own state-based exterior firewood quarantine, trying to prevent the pests into or further into their state. States in yellow there have some sort of quarantine that's more broad and is attributed to all quarantine pests, including emerald ash borer, or it's about firewood specifically, hardwood firewood, which we know emerald ash borer spreads on. And then you have states that are really covering their bases and have both an emerald ash borer and a firewood specific exterior quarantine separately. Interior quarantines, again, you see a little bit of a hodgepodge situation here. So these states that are kind of peach colored have some of their state, unfortunately, with emerald ash borer, and they're trying to prevent the further spread of that pest within the state with a quarantine. The blue has some sort of quarantine that's specific to firewood, and then the purple, again, really covering their bases, has both an emerald ash borer specific quarantine as well as a firewood specific quarantine. When we compare this to the detection map for emerald ash borer, this is actually from 2023, we see that it lines up a little bit. So some states out west, again, not seeing that pest yet, trying to prevent the introduction with exterior quarantines, which is great, but it's not all of them. And then interior, we see some states who are on that edge and have those interior quarantines, and then others that don't. So again, very context specific and changes a lot by geography and region. So again, to try to keep track of all this information and have it in one spot so people can have an understanding of what's going on there, we created the Firewood Comparison Report. This report looks at every single regulation in the United States that pertains to the movement of firewood. So again, not just firewood specific quarantines, but any of those quarantines under which firewood is a regulated article. We also looked at the certification ability and how that changed and is now across the United States. So all those states that have state-based certification programs. And then we also looked at outreach. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the outreach end, but I just want to say, like, big picture takeaway here is that there's a lot more need for consistency, and that would make the outreach environment a lot more comprehensive. So people can kind of quickly understand what's happening, where, and we can cover more states with protections, even if not legislatively, with outreach. So we can increase awareness and hopefully change some risky behavior. And so that's what we really hope to do. And of course, as an outreach campaign, we don't have any jurisdiction, or it's really not appropriate for us to be suggesting anything on the regulation front. But it's very much appropriate for us to suggest things on the outreach front. And so as part of this report, we had to try to kind of streamline it some way to look at outreach across the United States. And so we picked 4 main metrics for online locations that we felt it was important for firewood outreach to be available to folks. So we looked at any of the state agencies. Do they have firewood outreach, cooperative extension, and then very importantly, camping related pages and the reservation process, which tends to be a third-party vendor. And so on this firewood comparison report, each state has their own summary page, and we go over on those summary pages whether or not they have this outreach and specifically on what pages, and it's very detailed. So hopefully helpful to the people in those areas who are hoping to improve outreach. But of course, that is just like 4 areas, and it actually represents a lot more pages and potential pages to have this information. So it took a long time to make, and it's very much a deep dive into the outreach. And so this is, again, kind of just another snapshot of all the places that we think it's really important for states to have highly visible firewood outreach, because we're trying to reach everyone, of course, but there is 50% of the public that is still unaware of the connection between forest pest spread and the firewood pathway. And so we recommend having firewood information in all these locations on any relevant page, because especially those folks who don't know about this, they're not going to be seeking firewood information. They're going to be seeking other information about other things. And as long as it's even remotely related to firewood or recreationists that could be using firewood, we recommend to have those messages there. And that's going to really get to the preventative nature of effective firewood outreach. A lot of people who are familiar with our campaign have seen signage on billboards or at campground locations, and that's excellent. And, we have plenty of materials and opportunities for that sort of outreach. But once someone is already at a campground, they already have or have not brought firewood. So even the wording of physical signage, we recommend to be a little different and actually address the potential for someone to have already brought contaminated firewood versus the more preventative outreach on your online location. So we recommend it be really quite ubiquitous and comprehensive across all these locations. Especially State Department of Forestry. Our research shows that folks from these agencies are what is known as like trusted messengers. So people actually listen to you guys. and look to you for information on this topic. Also, as I already talked about, of course, state parks and campground reservation portals, very important for that information to be there and on all of the relevant pages within those websites, because that's where you're having people who are very likely to be using firewood. State-based pest pages. So any agency pages or cooperative extension pages, anything that have actual information on the pests that are known to move on the firewood pathway, have that information there. And you'd be surprised how many pages we see on pests like emerald ash borer that don't mention firewood. And so anytime someone's trying to learn about these pests, they need to understand how their behavior could be, you know, a force and for good or bad. And State Department of Agriculture, that tends to be the agency that states do have the most firewood outreach, according to our comparison report. And that's because they tend to be the regulating body behind quarantines that affect firewood movement. So really important that it's there. But again, not necessarily where a lot of your day-to-day firewood users and visitors are going to be accessing. Cooperative Extension as an outreach entity, very important for them to have pages. We often see articles that get buried over time. And so we do see a lot of outreach on this end, but we, for the most part, it tends to be what we call low visibility outreach, because usually it's something like we found an article from 2017. And the only reason I found it is because I'm putting in the search bar firewood. It's not open on like a main page. And then, of course, you know, national parks and national forests are very important too. That was beyond the scope of the comparison report. It already took so much time to do, and that is like a whole nother can of worms. But obviously those are other places that it's important to have this, and the campground reservation portals that they use. And then finally, even major counties and cities also beyond the scope of the comparison report. But we do recommend that they have some outreach as well, especially if they have any like major parks or if they have municipal waste pages. So again, trying to raise awareness, especially to those people who don't know about this issue in a way that they're going to just stumble upon it. The outreach that we recommend to have online, again, that preventative outreach, we really recommend having information on not only what they should not do, so coupling that Don't Move Firewood message with a more action-oriented, responsible alternative to what they should do. And again, this becomes very context dependent on your location. As we mentioned, a lot of places don't have certified heat treatment available, for instance. So it doesn't make sense to be like, you know, use heat-treated firewood in a lot of places in the country. So you really have to understand the situation where it is. And that's part of our job as well. At least one of these messages I recognize, like we helped them build. Something we've been doing recently for the states that ask for it. We've been expanding upon the outreach research synthesis that we've already done for the comparison report, and done an even deeper dive and created a custom outreach strategy for the locations that ask for it. And again, it's very time consuming because we go directly to all these sites, every possible site, any sites that have, you know, outdated outreach or no outreach at all. You know, we have screenshots and arrows and we say it should go here and this is exactly what it should say. And again, that's very attuned to the location and the regulatory environment in that area, or the best practice information that we think should be there. And those messages can be copy and pasted and put directly in those locations. We're trying to make this as easy as possible. Of course, if you want to change that to your needs, then go ahead. But we're just trying to do all the footwork for these places that have the capacity and the networking and the IT people and the outreach folks on board to actually make these changes and enhance their presence online for the benefit of hopefully preventing more problems. And we do see more problems, especially with emerald ash borer. So unfortunately, this pest has moved west. About 10 years ago in Colorado, it showed up. 2 years ago in Oregon, all the way to the West Coast. Washington County has an established population there that they're doing a lot of great work to try to manage. And then most recently, of course, it has been confirmed in Vancouver, British Columbia. So pretty positive that this is anthropomorphic movement or anthropogenic movement, excuse me, because this pest does not move more than a few miles in its lifetime. We see a lot of posts on our social media like, don't you know it has wings? These things can fly, and that's true, and that is, and we do see natural spread from emerald ash borer, but not hundreds of miles. The same way as when it's actually, hitchhiking with people and human behavior. So that's why our campaign is so important. Again, not just for this pest, but many others. But again, if we can just raise awareness and reduce the anthropogenic movement of these pests, then we won't see these huge jumps. Because now, not only are we still worried about the big jumps, but we are worried about spread from these established populations in the West. And so you'd see more spread in these entire regions. Which gives us a lot more work to do. So an exciting project coming up probably early this summer. We're excited to be working with the U.S. Forest Service to do really a custom outreach strategy on steroids for the R6 region, so Oregon and Washington. We see a lot of room for improvement for their outreach so far, and just a little pilot project we've done. And we're really hoping and excited to work with some new partners out there, targeting state, private, and tribal forestry in those tribal nations, and just really enhancing firewood outreach, getting a comprehensive message for that region and raising awareness so we can slow the spread of this pest and give folks time to be able to manage it and not see, such a quick devastation of the ash trees out there. Especially there's even like Oregon ash out there. So it's really, really precious species that we want to give a fighting chance against this pest. So really excited to work with them. That's a new project we have coming up. As I mentioned, we do these custom deep dives. We've done a couple already. The most recent one we're going to tackle is Texas. So I've been in touch with the state plant regulatory official there. And he's requested that we do a deep dive for them and really enhance their online outreach in Texas, as they've seen some recent movement, and he suspects it's related to firewood. So I'm probably going to dive into that after this webinar series, so next week. And that'll be the latest custom outreach strategy on that front. Other projects, so we have a research project going on right now, actually. We're still in the data collection stage. We are comparing emotional, more protective-based framing with objective science, fact-based framing on social media, on Facebook specifically. And we're seeing if one of these other, using everything else controlled, same pest, same picture, all of that good stuff with each of these messages, does one of these framings do any better in engagement and reach and all that than the other? And so we hope to have the results of that probably midsummer, going to analyze the results and then be able to talk more about the findings late summer, early fall, likely. And finally, these last several slides, I've really been focusing more on our tools and projects for outreach professionals and forest health professionals. But again, I just want to remind people, we do interact with the public directly, and we work with other partners who interact with the public directly. So I already talked about our map, and this is something I try to keep up to date every year. This regulatory environment, the pest problems, everything is so dynamic. It's constantly changing. So it's really important that we keep these materials accurate. And, every summer, early fall, I try to update the map. As I mentioned, I'm currently working on the comparison report. It's a lot, but it's really important and it's really useful for the public. So definitely send folks towards the firewood map. And also we work with Firewood Scout, and they're a great group. I believe there's 13 participating states. So in those states, people can type in their area code or wherever they are and find local firewood vendors. So again, very useful for the public themselves. And that's all I have, Leigh, if you want to bring us home.
Fantastic. Thanks, Laurel. We do some larger partnership projects that we wanted to highlight during the sort of Meet the Firewood team webinars, so that the scope of our interprofessional outreach is better understood by some of the folks that aren't familiar with it. So a couple key examples of current partner collaborations is that we work with NASMA's Play Clean Go campaign. NASMA, ooh, I'm going to try it. It's North American Invasive Species Management Association. It's a tough acronym. So they cover Canada, the United States, and they have some engagement in Mexico. And their Play Clean Go campaign is for recreationalists who need to be informed about stopping the movement of invasive species on all types of recreational everythings. So everything's from dirty boots, mountain bikes, horses, dogs, ATVs, RVs, etc. You can't clean firewood, and you definitely shouldn't go with firewood. So we work really closely with Play Clean Go in order to make sure that our message is sort of defined separately but productively with what Play Clean Go does. And that has been a really fruitful campaign for a long time, to make sure that each of our interests is interacts well so that the public does not become confused and so that we don't sort of cross wires on outreach messaging. We also extensively create custom graphics for all sorts of different partners, state, tribal, regional, federal, you name it. That is constantly something that we are doing, and it is an extremely productive way to get the Don't Move Firewood message to anybody who needs it. That is a free service for the graphical designs if the partner is located within the United States. And so, for instance, anytime a state person or a tribal person or a regional representative asks for a custom poster or billboard or a co-branded sticker, we can design those using our graphical design contractors and then send them the design, and then they pay for the printing, placement, or manufacturing of the item. We also advise Firewood Scout, as well as some of the other Firewood Scout-like crowdsourced websites that provide firewood vendor information. We are not directly affiliated with any of the firewood vendor listings, because that would be a little bit of a conflict of interest, as well as potentially just additional work burden that we cannot take on. But what we do is we make sure that their firewood transport related outreach messages are factually correct and aligned with the intent of our outreach, to make sure that, again, those partner collaborations are clear for the public, to minimize the chance of confusion, and to make sure that we're all sort of rowing the boat in the same direction when it comes to firewood. And then a fairly recent collaboration that we've been working on is the Firewood Banks program. We have worked with the Alliance for Green Heat on and off for a long time, and their management of the federal funding for firewood banks provided us with an outstanding opportunity to make sure that when it's important and necessary for firewood banks, oh, I forgot to mention, a firewood bank is kind of like a food bank. When somebody is struggling to get enough food to feed their family, they may visit a food bank. When somebody is struggling to get enough wood to heat their home, they might need a firewood bank. So the Firewood Banks program is for folks that are struggling to get enough wood to heat their home. And as you might guess, you would want that firewood to be sourced locally and distributed locally. And you would need to define locally according to the geography that you're in. So the definition of local in Northern Arizona might be very different than the definition of local in Southern Maine. And the firewood banks in those two respective areas would need professional assistance to better understand the rules and regulations and best practices. So we provide that professional assistance when requested from any partner with a firewood bank or from the Alliance from Green Heat partners that we've been working with for years. Next slide, please. We also, when we have budgets available, we place paid advertising in a wide variety of different formats. We have used for over 10 years a Google AdWords grant, which is an in-kind donation of AdWords space. Those are the little ads that pop up usually on the right or the top of Google when you type in a search term. That grant is currently on hiatus, but we're hoping to get it started again in a month or two. We use banner ads. Banner ads are the little slightly obnoxious ads that show up at the bottom of websites. And when we have funding, we sometimes will post those on appropriate websites, such as websites affiliated with campgrounds or camping equipment or recreational readership, like a magazine, online magazine, etc. We run Facebook ads and boosted posts. Those are slightly different, but you don't need to understand the difference. The point is that when we have funding, we try to target specific regions with specific messages in order to get more people to learn about Don't Move Firewood through Facebook, which is the most commonly used social network. We also, when we have funding, create print publications in appropriate publications such as the Old Farmer's Almanac is one we've advertised in the past. We often do travel guides for states. We do hunting and fishing regulations for some states. So travel, hunting and fishing, gardening, these are all interest groups that probably engage with firewood a lot for whatever reason. And so they are ripe for providing those folks with an introduction to firewood concerns. And so these are two examples of print publication advertisements that we've placed in the past on the screen you see. And then we take on other paid advertising projects when there's the funds available or when a partner has funds and they wish for us to custom design the product, and then they will place it in their hunting and fishing regulation or their travel magazine or whatever opportunity arises. Next slide, please. Here's a bunch of examples of some of our custom outreach items that we've done in the somewhat recent past. We customize these to look and feel the way that a place looks and feels, or a place wants to represent the issue, depending on what we're providing. So on the left, that is the Nevada Department of Agriculture requested that poster, and they wanted it to look like some of the high mountains of northern Nevada. On the right, the North Dakota advertisement has the sort of beautiful striped hills of the North Dakota Badlands, which are really cool looking, and a river, because a lot of people think, oh, there's no trees in North Dakota, which is absolutely not true. And they have a lot of trees near their riverways, and that is where the ash is growing. And so that particular advertisement really tried to call together the iconic landscapes of North Dakota and the fact that the ash trees grow near the rivers. And then South Dakota on the bottom right, that's that little star icon is a South Dakota icon. They were hoping for a billboard that was really visually dramatic. And so we went with a dark night scene of firewood so people would immediately recognize it. So we customize according to what people ask for, as long as it is considered within our best practices and our basic visual guidelines. We will provide you with something that works for both your needs and our needs. Next slide, please. We also, on the Don't Move Firewood website in the resource library, the URL is on the bottom right of this slide, so resource-library. We post a lot of our fun and different and visually engaging social media ideas and images. So social media presences need to be kept up to date, vibrant, different, eye-catching, variable. So we move away from our constant, our more consistent posters and billboards, and we try to really catch people's attention with some really exciting different visual designs. The format is also different. It's supposed to be nearly square as opposed to, for instance, a billboard. So we meet a lot of different needs with a lot of different products, and we try to put essentially everything onto the resource library, not quite literally everything, but very close. Next slide. We tried to anchor a lot of our outreach events with a calendar to make sure that there is a predictability for our partners who want to co-participate in some of our events. Right now, it's Emerald Ash Borer Awareness Week. Emerald Ash Borer Awareness Week was actually originally started by USDA APHIS Emerald Ash Borer staff quite some time ago. And they always designated it the week before Memorial Day because Memorial Day is one of the largest camping weekends of the year. So they thought it was a really good time to make sure that people were aware of the problems of emerald ash borer that week. We have continued that tradition by holding Emerald Ash Borer Awareness Week that same week in recent years. We also participate in Play Clean Go Awareness Week, which is set by NASMA, as I mentioned earlier. We use National Moth Week to talk about spongy moth and other invasive moths like brown-tail moth. Just because even though National Moth Week is focused on the beauty of moths, it's a great way to get people to pay attention to invasive moths. We talk a lot about Tree Check Month in August. That is a USDA APHIS-led initiative that focuses primarily on Asian longhorn beetle, but not exclusively. So in August, look at your trees is the big message there. And then we run our own event, Firewood Month, every October that has a structured set of 4 different themed weeks to allow people to participate in events, webinars, outreach, education, whatever you want, so that during the prime camping season for the southern United States, where it's too hot until October to go camping, and firewood collection season for the northern United States, where it's finally cooling down and people are really concerned about making sure they have enough firewood for the cooler months to heat their homes. It's a great time of year to focus on firewood. So that's when we do our signature awareness month. And then we participate in National Invasive Species Awareness Week, which in the US is in February. And then also we contribute content and ideas to Invasive Plant Pest and Disease Awareness Week, which is run by USDA APHIS and held every April. So it's a big outreach year. And as you can see, the URL that is in fine print at the bottom, Firewood Outreach Year, actually has additional events, but these are sort of our keystone ones that we try to include within our outreach calendar. Next slide, please. So this is our last slide. And wow, Laurel, we are right on time. I'm very proud of us. So many thanks to USDA APHIS for the continued financial support of this important work. And also, I will say, we are just about to begin this new Region 6 U.S. Forest Service grant that we are also very excited about, which will be focused on Washington and Oregon. So thanks in advance for the U.S. Forest Service's support of that project, which will also help us really extend our reach into a key geography in the next year or two. If you have any questions, you are always welcome to reach out to me or Laurel. Our emails are there. Either one of us is a great point of contact for any question, then we can refer you from there. At this point, we are ready for Q&A. It's exciting. All right. So the first question I see is, I think we need, Gary Fish from Maine says, I think we need to reach an audience that is not very receptive. Conservative males who are not as willing to comply with regulations. We need to do some social marketing research on the barriers to these folks because I think they are often making the decision to bring firewood with them. This is a very good point that you have to understand the motivations of every audience that is likely to perform the behavior that you don't want. And in the case of our work, we need to understand why people move firewood and how we can encourage them to change their behavior. It doesn't matter what type of person it is. Gary uses one example, but there's many different groups of people that might be motivated to move firewood, and we need to understand them so that we can provide them with acceptable options. You know, the easiest example of some of this is, for instance, the whole issue of certified heat-treated firewood not being available throughout the entire United States. You know, you have to tailor the message to what's a realistic alternative, and that's the easiest realistic alternative because it's literally, you can't buy it in some places. Other alternatives may vary. So Laurel, do you have something to add?
Yes, I think too, so part of our social media message frame testing touches on this because we know just anecdotally and everything that a lot of people don't like being told what not to do. But if they have sort of a sense of ownership, and for instance, you mentioned conservative males, a lot of conservative males are sportsmen and hunters, you know, people who get out like that. And a lot of those people are conservationists and care about the resources and the wildlife habitat and everything else. And so making those connections, you know, is very important. And that's something that we strive to do. And then once we, you know, get the results of this and see, you know, is there a difference? Are people more receptive to the protective, you know, based language of protecting these resources and things? You know, that is something that's going to be very useful to us. We don't know yet. But you know, it does bring up, like Leigh said, something that we have to consider all the time is different groups have different feelings, different identities, and connect with these resources in different ways. And so having just one standard, you know, sort of message frame all the time would not be useful. And we do mix it up and have these different outreach events, different themes in Firewood Month for that reason. Also, I will say something that we've noticed, and I've noticed in a lot of the data so far that we're collecting for these message tests, is in the areas that have had emerald outreach or emerald ash borer for a while now. I'm seeing a lot of people kind of throwing their hands up and being like, it's too late, it's everywhere, move the firewood around, it doesn't matter, you know. And so not focusing our outreach on a single pest is also really important, because people need to understand that it's not just one pest that moves around. But even in the places that, you know, have lost all their ash trees, unfortunately, like, or most of them, it's still really horrible to see that sort of reaction, because they don't understand that this pest can still move hundreds of miles into an area that doesn't have emerald ash borer yet. And it's the places that have emerald ash borer currently, you know, maybe it's a little late for them in their areas, but it's not late for the campground that they're going to go visit in a month or two. You know, it's not too late for other areas outside of that region. So, you know, two fronts there, making sure people realize that just because your ash trees are dying doesn't mean, you know, that it's a lost cause everywhere. And also it's not just this one pest. So trying to not hyper focus on one pest.
Yeah, and for the purposes of today's webinar, we did kind of ironically hyper focus a little bit on emerald ash borer because it's Emerald Ash Borer Awareness Week. So we are taking our normal Meet the Team Firewood webinar and we are making it Emerald Ash Borer focused on purpose. But very emphatically, the work of Don't Move Firewood does not focus exclusively or even primarily on emerald ash borer. It is one of the top offenders, but it is absolutely not the only firewood transported pest that we work on. We actually have I would say a pretty surprising number of different forest pests that we work on. And that actually proves to be an amazing segue to the next question by Pam Porter, which is such a good one. So I will read that and then I will start with the answer and Laurel can kick in. So Pam asks or states, Wisconsin regulations include heat treatment and storage, and says, store firewood on your premises for 24 months before selling or distributing in Wisconsin. What are your thoughts about the treatment efficacy of seasoning wood? I regrettably do not have very positive thoughts about the efficacy of seasoning wood, because the only strong result of seasoning wood is reducing the presence of forest pests that take a single seasonal year to mature in the wood. Pests that take multiple years to mature in the wood could still be viable in seasoned wood. And that does happen, especially in cold climates. Pests that infest cut wood have absolutely, such as the powder post beetle family is a great example. They have no qualms about infesting a pile of seasoning firewood and then being moved on seasoned firewood. And much more importantly than those two examples of pests that have long life cycles, as well as pests that infest contaminated wood, cut wood, is the contaminating pest family. So seasoned wood stored outdoors is at extremely high risk for the contaminating pest group, which includes things like spotted lanternfly, which can lay eggs or shelter in firewood and easily be transported in seasoned firewood. Spongy moth, which is a huge issue in the Wisconsin area, is well known for laying its egg masses in outdoor firewood piles. Brown marmorated stink bug, which is not really often thought of as a pest of firewood specifically because it's such a generalist, but because it shelters in the bark of cut and uncut trees, you can move populations of brown marmorated stink bug on seasoned firewood very, very easily. I could go on. I'll stop for a moment. Unfortunately, seasoning wood only reduces risk of a very specific clade or grouping of firewood pathway pests. Laurel, do you have anything you want to add?
I think you covered it really well. I was unaware of this until very recently. So I was on a firewood podcast, and one of the gentlemen hosting that podcast lives in Wisconsin, and he brought this up and he said, you know, what's the efficacy of doing this? Why is it okay for 2 years? You know, is it? And I was actually so thrown off by not knowing that, that I was like, I wasn't of mind to go into everything that Leigh just said. And I thought, well, maybe it's the life history strategy of spongy moth that they're less likely to lay their eggs on already dead trees, you know, blah, blah, blah. So after 2 years, they're probably gone, but that's exactly correct. It's spongy moth, if you have about enough infestation, could certainly be laying their eggs on the wood still. And secondly, there's a lot of other pests that could do that, especially spotted lanternfly, which we've seen is spreading very fast across, you know, across the US already. And so the egg masses of spotted lanternfly blend in incredibly well with things like bark. And, you know, you're not, the average person is not going to notice that that is an egg mass and not like a little mud splatter or another piece of bark or lichen or something. It's just so hard to see. It's very cryptic. So, you know, seasoning, like it's not as effective as it should be in terms of like actually moving that firewood around. So that's also my opinion as well.
Yeah, and so that's perfect. And it is kind of an underappreciated issue because we think so hard about heat treatment of firewood. And we don't think so much about hitchhiking pests or contaminating pests. Those are synonymous. One's a more technical term and one's a more layperson term. And it's a huge issue. And I think the Wisconsin-based best practices or regulations come from a mental image of emerald ash borer. Unfortunately, Wisconsin had such an enormous impact from emerald ash borer, and indeed, emerald ash borer does normally emerge from firewood in that area within approximately 1 year of harvest. And so normally that would really reduce the chance of firewood in Wisconsin having viable emerald ash borer in it. But emerald ash borer, as we're going to keep talking about, is absolutely not the only concern for firewood. And so that is a great example of a regulation that perhaps got overly focused on a single pest, as opposed to looking at a more holistic viewpoint of firewood as a pathway for many, many pests. I also see in the Q&A, Pam, that you ask for us to provide you a summary and citations and so forth. We can absolutely do that. Laurel and I will correspond with you later to figure out what you need, and we would be happy to provide you with that information. Because it's definitely a question we have tackled in a couple different formats in the past. So I'm going to dismiss that one, Pam, but please feel free to email us directly if you'd like to. And then I will get to Gary Fish's statement, which I'm just going to say is 100% true. Gary Fish writes in the Q&A, I find we often use language that is too scientific and or regulatory, and it turns off the folks that are most likely to bring firewood with them. Yes, that is true. At the Don't Move Firewood campaign, Laurel and I and all of our partners, we really try to bring home the idea that we have to meet people where they're comfortable at listening to us, where they understand our terms and our vocabulary. Legal language, scientific language, regulatory language is often an active turnoff. So Laurel and I work really hard to make things easily relatable, easily read, and easily understood. A big bonus of that also is that it's much easier for folks who English is not their first language. And it translates better if you run it through Google Translate. So when you use simple language, it benefits everybody in every way. And then last but not least, Randall Oliver asks, oh, we're getting more questions. This is so exciting. Randall Oliver asks, how about processed firewood like you buy at a grocery store or a big box retailer? Great question. Processed firewood is often safer than the alternative of backyard firewood, because processed firewood is often harvested from natural forests or other more controlled environments. But the big thing that usually makes it safer is that it is often certified heat treated firewood in areas where that's available, or sometimes it is kiln dried, which is not a regulatory statement, but is certainly better than absolutely no treatment whatsoever. So generally speaking, cut, bundled firewood at a grocery store or big box retailer will be a lot safer than the alternative of bringing your own firewood to and fro from natural environments and backyards. Especially because many states, but not all states, have regulatory frameworks like external quarantines that Laurel went into detail on. And so especially the firewood retailers and distributors that have large businesses that span multiple states, they often must certify heat treat their firewood, even if only one state in their distribution network requires it, because it would be wildly impractical to send different types of firewood to different places. So they just end up with heat treated certified firewood in the market of their region because it's more cost and functionally effective than having lots of different types of firewoods for different markets in different states. So generally, processed firewood at a grocery store or big box retailer will be quite a bit safer, maybe not perfect. But when we're talking about like a spectrum of risk, it's a lot safer. I can see we're going to run out of time, which is fine. If anybody needs to hop off before we address Susan's question, thank you very much to everybody for attending, but we will answer Susan's question, and then the answer to Patrick's question is yes, absolutely, and we'll get back to you on that.
I was just gonna say, like, I could type that if you
Yeah, that's an easy one. If you want to type an answer for Patrick, that'd be great. So for Susan asks, how local is local for firewood? Oh, such a great question. I live near beach camping and people are selling firewood close by. I asked where they sourced the wood and they said old avocado orchards, which would have to be 30 miles in. Is that local? Otherwise, for beach camping, there isn't local firewood. Or do you know if California has kiln-dried firewood? Oh boy, that's a big question. So let's start with this. Local is highly regionally dependent. And sometimes moving firewood basically at all is a problem. And other times moving firewood relatively long distances by mileage is not a huge issue. But let's just stick with the example you have. Old avocado orchards could be really problematic because of the presence of multiple species of pests that affect avocado trees in California. So in that context, you would really hope that kiln-dried firewood would be available on the market in California. Regrettably, that's not, regrettably, certified heat-treated firewood is not typically on the market in California, but kiln-dried firewood, which again is not a regulated statement, but is certainly better than nothing, is available in California. So I'm talking around the issue, but the answer is that it's highly context dependent and unfortunately very inconsistent. How local is local when firewood movement has been modeled, which was done, I believe it was in Wisconsin, possibly Minnesota, I don't remember. Around the Great Lakes, they did some modeling and they determined that about 10 miles is the best possible metric for how local is local. But that is often highly variable. And also that was specific to the Great Lakes forests and pest concerns. So for instance, in California, it could be very different. Those are wildly different places. So it's really not a straightforward answer. I wish it was. It's a lot better to be selling salvaged avocado wood 30 miles away than it is 300 miles away. So part of it too is mitigation is much more important than perfection. And if we can find kiln-dried wood, or better yet, certified heat-treated wood for sale in California, that would be preferable. Susan follows up with, we would still worry about gold-spotted oak borer, that's GSOB, and invasive shot hole borers. Yes, gold-spotted oak borer is present in typically mature oaks in Southern California. Movement of oak wood in Southern California is not desirable because of that. You could easily spread gold-spotted oak borer. And then invasive shot hole borer is one of the pests that, if memory serves, actually will infest and kill avocado trees as well as many other different types of trees. There are multiple types of shot hole borers. They were actually in one of the slides that we presented earlier, that firewood that was covered in little black speckles, that was invasive shot hole borer in California. And that would be a great example of a pest that has lots of different trees it infests. So moving old avocado wood could take, for instance, invasive shot hole borers in the avocado wood and put that invasive shot hole borer in an area where it could infest willows or box elders, which is a type of maple tree. And those are pests those are hosts of that same pest because it has such a wide variety of trees that it'll infest. So this is a tremendously complicated issue. And a difficult one in California, especially because of the wide variety of pests and trees and geographies. So, well, on that cheerful note, it's a great example of how important it is to regionally specifically form regulations, recommendations, and best practices, because it does vary so much across the United States and Canada. And I really appreciate everybody's participation today. Remember, we have 3 more webinars. You have to sign up for them separately according to what you prefer. And thank you all for your time.
Stop recording now.
Excellent. All right, so everybody is free to go. Thanks.